Chapter 21. Rievers.
Dia looked up in annoyance. Her skin was blue with cold, and her body ached terribly. She felt as stiff and frozen as an iceberg on the horse's back. The sky was cloudy. It was early morning. Minas had probably not yet appeared over the horizon, although it would have been hard to see it. A thick blanket of dark gray clouds covered the sky above her. Even the majesty of Yelm in all its glory could not penetrate the dense wall of mist. A cold breeze blew down from the icy peaks of the mountains they were passing through. It made it necessary to cover themselves with the furs they normally used for sleeping. Garin only wore a black embroidered cloak with a hood, which had no doubt seen better days. Alwyn seemed less affected by the chill and placed his cloak over the young woman's legs. His dwarven metabolism allowed him to resist the cold better. It had been several days since they had left the ghostly forest for the steep gorge of the massif the elves called the Belgarar. Yet it felt as if a decade had passed. Much of this was due to the radical change in the new terrain. It was spectacular to travel among these stone peaks crowned by perpetual blankets of snow. The landscape was undoubtedly colder and harder to walk through, but by contrast it was much more varied and dynamic. The mere sight of a small fox or a herd of fallow deer triggered moments of excitement in the three remaining human travelers and served to lift their spirits. Recent events had definitely marked a hard turning point in the march. The loss of Dickie and myself was an enormous burden for the others, who were still struggling to come to terms with what had happened. Facing up to our disappearance was a painful experience that caused serious emotional distress. Having such a close and direct relationship with death made them much more aware of the fragility of their own existence. Much more aware of how much they depended on these two elves to lead the way, and to safety. Olwen's fiery temperament had served to create a sense of mistrust among the surviving humans, who began to feel less secure around him than they had before. Alex, in particular, had been openly suspicious of him ever since their past dispute, and the fight with Dickie. Alwen had done much to reinforce that image, always keeping his distance from the group of musicians. Garin had been increasingly concerned about his companion's erratic behavior lately, especially since his return from the Elven City. Though, as always, the blonde elf always found time to exchange a few words with his human companions, no matter how trivial the conversation. Alwen never left the position at the head of the group, and rarely engaged the musicians in conversation unless they initiated it. Night fell. The threatening clouds still loomed over them from their unattainable heights. Not a drop of rain fell on the group, for which they were all grateful. The temperature dropped even lower in the early hours of the morning. The warmth of a campfire was essential. Alwen had moved a few steps away from the crackling flames. He was leaning against the ledge of a stone wall, painstakingly sharpening the terrible teeth of his magnificent sword. Garin approached to bring him a bowl of steaming broth. Alwen said nothing as his companion offered him the stimulating drink. He simply bowed his head and lowered his gaze in a characteristic gesture of gratitude before taking a comforting sip of the warm brew.
"The girl and the young man have come down with a fever,"
Garin reported with concern.
"It seems the cold of these peaks has affected them more than we expected. They need warm clothing, Alwen. The furs are not enough."
Alwen glanced back towards the campfire. The three musicians were huddled together, wrapped in blankets and furs in the warm glow of the flames. Claudia had fallen asleep on Alex's lap, confirming the affection and closeness that linked the two friends. Hasi looked at the elven couple with a stern, cold expression on his face.
"They'll survive,"
Alwen said scathingly as he glanced at the humans, before setting the Ariel down beside him. He pulled out a pendant he had rescued from the depths of the elven underground labyrinthine. Its simple forms glowed in the flickering light of the campfire as he held it before him. He turned it in his fingers with slow, deliberate movements, inspecting all its contours and intricate details. It was a simple golden fragment with a slightly curved shape. There was no evidence of further ornamentation or filigree, except for a few characters engraved on one side. A phrase written in Sanskrit, the arcane language of the Dore priests, could be read on it. Dai Ishman Tadau Halai.
Do you have any idea how that got down there?
Garin's question hung in the air. There was only one answer, really, an answer that raised many more questions.
From Ishmant to the circle.
Alwen translated, his gaze lost in the simple shapes of the jewel. Ariel, his wife and Dorai Virgin of the Dragon Order, had taught him the forbidden language of her mysterious order. Like so many other things, he owed the ability to read such an archaic dialect to his lost wife. Too many memories. Too many. A resigned sigh escaped the warrior's lips.
If he has been down there, something tells me we'll know soon enough.
What do you think they're up to?
Whispered Alex with suspicion. He had noticed that Hansi had been following the elves' conversation.
They keep looking at us. How long do you think it will be before they decide to forget us and cast us aside?
Alex continued to caress the dark strands of the young woman's hair as she lay asleep. For the first time in a long while, Hansi looked away from the elves and turned to his friend.
Don't worry,
he said in a calm voice.
They're not going to hurt or abandon us. No way.
What makes you think that?
Otherwise we'd be dead. But we're still breathing. And that's definitely a good sign. Claudia was right. They won't abandon us.
My compatriots became so accustomed to being ignorant of their destination that they gave up asking their guides for more information. In truth, the response from the elves was always vague or cryptic in the best of circumstances. They fully embraced the philosophy of the idiom. What you don't know can't hurt you, realizing that they were more at ease if they did not know where their steps were taking them. They decided to trust that their elven protectors would eventually lead them to something, or someone, that could end their exile. As dusk fell, the weather worsened again, and the sky returned to the overcast and depressing state of the past few days. Alex soon showed signs of improvement. However, problems began to arise with Claudia and Hansi, who were less protected from the cold. Especially the young woman whose fever had not improved and threatened to get worse. She could barely keep herself upright in the saddle, half buried in all the furs and blankets provided to her. Yet despite the extra layers, she continued to shiver. The icy breath of the wind seemed to find its way through the protection of her garments, chilling her to the bone. Garin was touched by the fragility of the young woman and tried to make sure she lacked nothing. He often inquired about her condition and was always ready to make conversation with her to raise her spirits. A cold north wind blew from the Albabren, from the winter of Valhind, as the elves called it. Strong gusts of freezing air numbed the skin on their faces and hands. The snow began to settle on the ground. They emerged into a small valley after passing between the rugged cliffs of two colossal peaks. The terrain flattened out, gradually replacing the steep slopes of the escarpment they were descending. A carpet of snow several inches thick covered the fresh grass and roots of the trees in this verdant landscape. Here, the trees could grow more luxuriantly, scattered over several miles in a meadow of green and white. A small stream of water, as clean and crystalline as it was icy, snaked down from the frozen peaks of the mountains in twists and small cascades. A narrow strip of life and vegetation flourished along its course, like an oasis of paradise in the immensity of the void. The party was marching towards the stream when Garin brought his horse to an abrupt halt. Alwen pulled on the reins of his mount, and did likewise. No incident of note had occurred during these days of travel. Both warriors had been careful not to venture into areas that might prove dangerous, even if it slowed their progress. The fair-haired half-elf veered off the path, for no apparent reason. Alwen turned to him and asked if everything was all right. But as he looked at the landscape before us, the answer came without a word from Garin's lips. The rest of the horses also came to a halt. Before them, dozens of saplings had been uprooted from the ground. Others were savagely broken in two, their splintered stumps sticking pitifully in the air like broken flagpoles. Most larger trees were more fortunate, albeit showing signs of damage. Although still upright, they had suffered deep gashes and scars in their battered trunks. A trail of felled trees, wooden stumps, fallen branches, and scattered vegetation stretched out before them. Since entering Belgaraz's domain, the elves had made a detour to avoid the lair of the Titan bear. They had also had to take cover from a Cyclops goshawk, which they spotted in the vicinity. But this devastation had been caused by a far more dangerous creature, and a much bigger one. Garin quickly dismounted and approached the carnage that littered the area. Alwen immediately joined him. From there they could see the stream only a few dozen paces away. The wind whistled as it swept down the valley, rustling through the leaves and branches of the hedgerows. The rest of the group remained in their saddles, covered by their blankets and numb from the bitter cold. The first sunset was near. Its light, already subdued by the turbulent grey sky, would gradually fade. The persistence of the wind heralded another storm, which, at these altitudes, would certainly bring more snow. Garin's hand gently caressed a deep gash that had split the bark on one of the trees. His fingers mingled with the sap that bled from the wound. For a moment, he shared the pain of the silent and seemingly mindless creature.
If the trees could scream,
he said, almost in a nostalgic whisper.
This place would be a symphony of torment.
Alwen dismounted in time to hear his words. The chains of his armor clanked gracefully as he approached his friend. An elf may refuse words to all other races, but he will gladly converse with animals and plants, just as a dwarf communes with stone and metal. A part of his spirit is bound to them. Garin had grown up with elves and felt like an elf. He turned his head to Alwen, who had stopped a few feet away. He spoke, anticipating his friend's question.
Rievers,
he said.
They were Rievers. Who, if not them, could leave such obvious traces?
But Alwen's answer left him somewhat perplexed.
I know,
he said firmly, speaking with an absolute conviction that was rare even for him. Garin was surprised by his friend's unambiguous certainty. Alwen's eyes looked to the ground beneath his feet. The warrior's boot fitted easily into a huge footprint left in the snow. It was the shape of a deformed foot, with 3 toes, ending in claws. There was also the unmistakable imprint of a spur on the heel. Unfortunately, the owners of these footprints were obvious to anyone who had previously encountered them. The faces of the 2 elves adopted impassive masks as they exchanged glances. By now, the musicians had all grown accustomed to the long wordless dialogues they held with each other, as if their minds were merged into a single entity.
The wound is still bleeding, and the sap is fresh,
Garin said before grabbing the carved warbow he carried on his back.
They can't be far from here.
Why they?
Asked Alwen, drawing the sleeping Ariel out of her warm fur abode and scanning the forest with a concentrated look on his face. The sight of the elves unsheathing their weapons sent a chill down the spines of the musicians, who sat up in their saddles and looked at each other nervously.
It's not a female. There must be at least 2 males.
Garin declared, placing an arrow on the loose string of his ornate elven bow.
And by the spirits of the forest, I hope there are no more.
Can't be.
His companion contradicted him.
We would have smelled them. These things stink of dead flesh. The wind is blowing very...
A disturbing thought crept into their minds, bringing with it a terrifying realization. The wind. They had been going downwind all along. A deadly error. The fear of ambush, of danger, of being taken by surprise. How to explain that? How to explain the churning in a warrior's gut when he knows that death awaits at any moment, that it lurks in the shadows and strikes from behind? Their eyes met again. The 2 young elves turned to the group, the mask of fear shadowing their pupils. Their throats shouted in unison an order that startled the others.
Get down! Dismount! Get off the horses!
Those on the saddles looked at each other with furrowed brows, without reacting to the command.
By Mayhem's destroyer,
shouted Olwen, waving his arms energetically.
Move or you'll be a side dish for lunch.
They did not understand why the elves were so agitated. Although the musicians were disconcerted, they still did not obey their frantic exhortations. Off to one side, heading in the direction of the group, a sound of snapping branches spread through the forest. Olwen tried to locate its source, but the bodies of the horses were in the way and prevented him from doing so. Then he looked to his side. Garin had closed his eyes and was muttering something as he began to draw his bow.
What's going on?
One of the musicians finally asked. Alwen was rushing towards them.
Trolls!
The cold shadow of fear hung over the group as the horses began to buck frantically under their saddles. For a moment, chaos reigned supreme.
What did he say?
Alex asked Claudia. The young woman was overcome by a sudden wave of panic.
My God! Get off the horse, Alex, quickly!
They both hurried to dismount, but Hansi was still fixed to his saddle, as if oblivious to the outside world.
Hansi!
cried Alex.
Hansi! Odin!
The burly young man could only stare wide-eyed into the forest, sitting motionless on his restless horse. Then Alex saw what was paralyzing his friend. A large, gigantic shadow was approaching the horses with obvious intent. He saw its dead, pupilless eyes boring into his face, as if to burn it into its memory. He saw its terrible jaws and its array of razor-sharp teeth, and smelled their unmistakable stench. Then he, too, was frozen to the spot. It seemed to rise from the very ground on which the horses were standing, although Hansi knew it was not so. It charged furiously at the first animal with incredible speed, its huge frame knocking down 2 of the horses and sending the rest into a hysterical panic. The muscled young man flew through the air as he was catapulted violently from his saddle. He was thrown against the body of another horse nearby before landing on the cold snow with a thud. Alex found himself pinned under the heavy bulk of his mount, which showed no sign of life after the brutal collision. Although Claudia was a little more distant from the horses, she was also knocked over in the fray. Human screams and the whinnies of horses mingled together in a concerto of chaos. Fallen mounts lay struggling on the ground among the supplies and belongings which had spilled from the saddlebags onto the ground. Alwen came running with his sword in his right hand. He was forced to slow down as he dodged the flight of the panicked horses scattering in all directions. The fleeing animals would have to be caught, but that was not the main concern at the moment. Claudia had managed to get to her feet, but was disorientated in the chaos that swirled around her. A dark, ominous shadow forced her to look up. A horse was standing over her with panicked eyes, lifting its forelegs over her head. She lifted her arms to protect herself, as the animal threatened to crush her with its unshod hooves. Something grabbed Claudia's fragile body, propelling her out of the horse's reach. The powerful hooves crushed the snow below them, but fortunately, the young woman was no longer there. Both bodies rolled for a short distance on the wet ground, before coming to a halt. Hansi slowly rose to his feet. His right hand brandished the axe in expectation of real combat for the very first time. He had grabbed it in an act of reflex that he could not explain. He could not even be sure if he would find the courage to swing it at anyone. Or anything. All seemed calm now, after those seconds of mayhem and disorder. The whinnies of the horses faded as the animals fled into the woods. Silence returned to the scene. The only sound was the wind, which was beginning to blow strongly now. It carried with it the moans and agitated movements of Alex, still trapped under the belly of his horse. The whistling of the wind grew louder, but could not drown out the sound of breaking bones. Alwens sprung into action as soon as his body stopped rolling. She saw with relief that Claudia was lying unhurt beside him. He scanned the scene around him to assess the situation. He saw Hansi, axe in hand, facing their attackers only a few feet away. The corpulent young man stood there motionless, almost without taking a breath. He quickly realized the mortal peril the young drummer was in. Before him were two magnificent specimens of apex predators, as tall as mountains. Their bodies were covered with a leathery, dark, grayish-green skin, cratered with deformities and protuberances. They had strong, muscular legs and disproportionately long arms. All their limbs ended in fearsome claws. From their knees, elbows and shoulders surged razor-sharp yellow-colored spurs, which were imposing and terrifying to look at. Their heads were big and powerful, terrible masks of horror that far surpassed the imaginary monsters of our worst childhood nightmares. They had small, beady red eyes, which had neither iris nor pupils, buried in huge, empty eye sockets. And their jaws. Their powerful jaws contained several rows of teeth, reminiscent of the sharpest war sabers. With these they tore into the convulsing body of a horse. They effortlessly ripped out muscle, sinew, and bone in alarming proportions. Those terrible jaws could tear a man in half with a single bite. And there they were, just a few steps away. They didn't seem to care about anything but the piece of flesh they were eating. It was horrifying to know that their unfortunate victim would not distract them forever. Alwen hurried to cover Claudia's mouth with his hand and pressed his lips to her ear.
Listen to me. Listen to me very carefully.
The elf whispered in a firm tone of voice.
They cannot see you. They are almost blind. If you don't move, they won't attack you.
The young woman managed to calm herself, while not taking her terror-filled eyes off the ferocious beasts. Alwen looked over to Alex, who was trying to free himself from under the corpse of his mount. The young musician looked back at the elf, with fear in his eyes. Alwen raised his finger to his lips. Alex understood the silent message and nodded in acknowledgement. He stopped struggling and lay still. Alwen then glanced over to Garin, who was standing nearby. The blonde half-elf now held his bow taut and ready. The tip of the arrow spouted a burning flame without anything or anyone having ignited it. The burning arrow is a quick and easy spell to cast. Both Garin and Alwen knew that fire would be a useful ally in the coming battle. The archer remained motionless, but alert, waiting for the optimal moment to let loose his flaming projectile. They would have to act quickly. The spell could wear off at any moment.
Listen to me very carefully, little one.
Claudia heard the half-breed's voice whisper in her ear.
Time is our enemy. Let us get up very slowly.
The young woman nodded her head to signal she understood and lifted herself silently from the ground.
They cannot see you, but they can sense you with their hearing and smell. As long as we stay still, they will think we are dead or part of the scenery. That will give us a head start, but it won't save us. Do you understand?
The young woman nodded again in reply.
I need you to run there towards that mound of snow and bury yourself in it.
The young woman's face crumpled. She didn't like that idea very much. He had just told her not to move. She feared that the elf intended to use her as bait.
I need you to distract them with your presence so that mine goes unnoticed. Then I can sneak up on them. Do you think you can do that?
Although in a state of anxiety, Claudia promised that she would. Fortunately, Hansi had still not moved while facing the trolls.
Whatever happens, whatever you hear behind you, Keep running without looking back, for death will be running after you, and you must be quicker. If you reach the snow and cover yourself with it, you will muffle your sounds and hide your presence. I will cut them off before they get to you. It's going to be difficult. Are you ready?
The half-breed waited for a gesture of confirmation.
Run, Claudia! Run! Come on! Move, now!
Alwen shouted as loudly as he could, while raising his sword into an attack position. Hansi turned, as the elf's scream brought him out of his trance. Claudia began to run frantically across the snow, faster than she had ever run before. Adrenaline coursed through her veins as she fled, driving her forward. Alerted to the sound of the young woman's footsteps, one of the Rievers left his meal and bounded after her. Alwen rushed after it. Garin was standing by a tree with bow at the ready, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. As the giant troll moved after Claudia, Garin looked intently down the shaft of his flaming arrow, keeping the target in his sights. The young woman heard movement behind her, but it only served to drive her onwards towards the snowfield, which never seemed to get any closer. Alwen was significantly smaller than the troll, but also much faster. He managed to slip in front of it, blocking its pursuit of the fleeing young woman. With a powerful thrust, he plunged his sword upwards into the lower abdomen of the giant beast, driving the point of the aerial through several inches of flesh between the lower ribs. Thick black blood began to pour down the jagged steel blade. The monster stopped with a grunt of pain and turned to face the impudent elf. The flame from the arrow continued to burn. Alwen had halted the target, and the troll's neck was clearly exposed. The hit was certain. The wound would be fatal. No, not yet. The troll swung the claws of its right hand towards Alwen, but the elf anticipated the attack. Instead of trying to pull away from the deadly flaying limb, Alwen viciously hacked at the joint that held it to the rest of the troll's massive body. The Ariel's steel jaws tore through the rough flesh and broke the bone underneath. The troll's amputated hand fell limply to the snow. The creature, nearly 10 feet tall, leant backwards as far as its spine would allow and howled in agony. Alwen didn't waste a second, and with equal force, he drove the metal of his weapon into the troll's stomach until it struck bone. The wound splashed the viscous blood of the beast across the Mostel elf's face and chest. The Riever howled in pain once again. Garin, still taking aim, pleaded for a little more time. Claudia at last reached the mound of snow and threw herself into it, desperately shoveling handfuls of the cold white crystals over her body. Though hot and sweaty from her desperate flight, she could not avoid the terrible, icy bite of the snow on her bare skin. Her first impulse was to get out, but she did not. Her fear was stronger than the cold. She lay there shivering, buried in the snow, and tried to think of something positive. Alwen knew that staying too close to the enraged predator could cost him his life. Its wounds would close soon, but they would give him the time he needed. There was still another one left. With a mighty heave, he pulled the serrated blade of his mighty sword out of the troll's flesh. The beast roared again in pain. He skipped nimbly away from a flaying hand and ran towards the horse under which Alex was trapped. Hansi was standing motionless as the scene unfolded before him, undecided as to what he should do. Roaring with fury, the injured troll pursued the half-dwarf towards the horses. The freshly opened wounds caused by the aerial would have easily split a man of Hansi's size in two. Blood still flowed from it, but what should have been a gush of liquid from the elbow stump was now nothing more than a feeble trickle of blood. The vicious rib wound inflicted by the sword's serrated blade was now nothing but a light scar. Alwen's objective was the saddlebags of Alex's horse. In them, they stored the pots containing the oil they used for cooking. It was the flammable liquid inside he was looking for, but unexpectedly, a root buried in the snow caught his boot, causing him to trip and fall. The aerial slipped from his hand and out of his reach. The troll was already on him. The half-breed turned on the ground just in time to see the massive beast swing the claws of its remaining hand towards him. Garin was sweating profusely from the tension. If he had launched his arrow at that moment, all the waiting would have been for nothing. Alwen gritted his teeth, hoping to somehow evade the onslaught from the savage beast. But it never came. A loud howl of determination, a Viking war cry, filled his ears. Hansi had stepped forward and boldly swung his mighty orc axe into the beast's chest. The beast recoiled with a grunt. Its companion was fortunately still occupied in feasting on the horse. Alwen did not hesitate to take advantage of this unexpected opportunity. The human's bravery had allowed him to escape from the beast's clutches. He would not waste it. He quickly scrambled over to Alex's horse, where he reached for the pots of oil in the saddlebags. Garin sighed with relief, his arrow still trained on the troll. Hansi couldn't believe what he had done. He didn't even realize that he had saved the elf's life. All he knew was that the blade of his axe was embedded in the body of that thing. However, it seemed to have little effect on it. The beast looked at him as if the pain of the blow was nothing more than a minor irritation. Now it wanted revenge. The troll's tiny eyes darted from the wound to the human, and then back to the wound. Its face convulsed in a roar of fury. With a rapid yank from its undamaged hand, it effortlessly pulled the steel blade from its belly. Hansi was left speechless as the bleeding wound began to close by itself. The young man had no chance to retreat. The troll slammed its three-toed foot into the drummer's muscular body. The sharp blade of its spur pierced and tore through his flesh, causing blood to spray everywhere. Hansi was thrown violently to the ground and lay still on his stomach. The troll brought its battered and deformed body to its full height. Opening its crimson-stained jaws, it let out a blood-curdling screech. At that moment, the other troll stopped eating and turned its massive head towards the group. The troll's theatrical display of force had given Alwen the time he needed. He picked up his sword and moved fleet-footed towards the beast. The troll seemed far more preoccupied with demonstrating its dominance than keeping track of the nimble elf. With a quick movement, Alwen placed the oil pot on the ground and grabbed the hilt of the Ariel with both hands. With a rapturous scream, the half-breed launched himself against the troll, his dwarven blood boiling in his veins. The serrated blade swished through the air and slashed viciously through the most vulnerable part of the beast's body, its legs. With one brutal and accurate strike, the Ariel sliced straight through the sinew and bone of its left knee. A screech of agony filled the air as the troll's lower leg fell away from its thigh. The mountain of flesh tottered unsteadily for a moment, a fountain of blood spurting from the ravaged stump before crashing unceremoniously onto the blood-stained snow. The troll's head was now at Alwen's level. He grabbed the pot of oil and smashed it against the beast's forehead. A dark, viscous liquid poured over its hideous face. Garin grinned maliciously, his deep blue eyes focused on the grotesque oil-covered features of the Riever.
Now,
he whispered to himself. The hunter was now the hunted. His fingers loosened the grip he had held for so long, and the taut string sprung forward. Guided by the wind, the arrow was propelled inexorably towards its victim. The magical fire still rippled from the steel tip, tracing a blaze of fire through the cold, frosty air. Bone cracked as inches of red-hot steel pierced the beast's skull. The arrow lodged in the center of the troll's face, now only inches above the ground. The flame from the arrow tip ignited the oil, turning the beast's massive head into a blazing inferno. Alwen leapt aside as the troll began to screech in pain, flailing wildly in a vain attempt to extinguish the flames that consumed its face. Its agonizing screams alerted the other troll, who stopped dead in his tracks, now aware of his ally's fate. The smell was sickening. Alwen stood before the second Riever, who appeared to see him with his dead eyes. It seemed undecided. It did not know whether to advance or retreat. It just snarled wildly, drooling copiously through its blood-stained teeth. Garin's hand quickly drew a pair of arrows from his quiver. He shot both of them into the body of the wounded troll as it tried to drag itself along the ground, leaving a wide trail of blood in its wake. Both arrows lodged in its neck, and the beast collapsed to the ground, its blackened head still crowned with fire. Then his gaze went to the limp and wounded body of the corpulent human. The blond half-elf placed his warbow on his back and covered himself with his black cloak before rushing out towards Hansi's inert form. As he ran, he was already preparing another spell. A searing cold pain ripped through Hansi's stomach as his eyelids reopened. He remembered his body falling limp and heavy onto the white canvas of snow. For a moment, he struggled to recall the events that had brought him to this position. But when they came back to him, he realized that he had lost consciousness for a moment. He could not see the troll. He was not conscious of the events from a few moments before. Everything was calm. But he was not lying on the snow now, but leaning against the trunk of a tree. He could not remember getting there by himself. It was obvious that he had been helped by someone. At first, after his vision had cleared, he did not recognize the figure leaning over him. A male voice ordered Hansi to remain silent, but then identified himself as Garin. At first, Hansi thought he may be hallucinating, but soon realized that it was not a figment of his fevered imagination. The features of the elf were unusual. His face seemed wider and harder. His shoulders were a little broader and stockier. His arms showed powerful biceps, and his legs were strong and muscular. Only in this way could he have lifted the giant's massive frame and dragged him to safety, with an incantation. A pool of dark blood blackened the lower half of Hansi's shirt, soaking his stomach and arms. Garin had placed both his patient's hands on the wound, telling him to press hard. Despite his strength, his muscles trembled in uncontrollable spasms, and Hansi was unable to press as hard as he needed to. Feeling his pulse weakening, he tried to pull his hands away to look at the wound under the fabric of his shirt, but Garin stopped him. The elf gently put them back in place and shook his head.
You really don't want to see that,
he added with a smile.
Your legs are much more attractive, believe me.
I'm going to die, aren't I?
Hansi gasped with aplomb.
That's why you're joking.
A spasm of coughing shook the young man, who could barely open his eyes. He didn't know it yet, but the troll had disemboweled him. The wound was serious, but Garin had to help Alwen kill the second of the Rievers. Hansi's wound would not be healed with a quick spell. He needed more time for that, which he did not have at the moment.
What are you talking about?
Replied Garin with a smirk.
No, not just when I was starting to like you.
The remark managed to elicit a smile from the dying human.
No, you will not die,
the archer stated firmly, even if the confidence expressed was only feigned.
I will not lose anyone else. Do you understand? Your hair will grow long before that happens, I assure you. You acted decisively and bravely at the right time, my boy. Your intervention saved Alwen and gave us the chance we needed. If I were you, I would be very proud.
The noise of a fierce battle filtered through the forest, even though it was out of sight.
Now, Alwen needs me. You will be safe here. Hold on a little longer.
Hansi nodded his head, understanding the urgency of the matter. Then Garin grabbed hold of his mighty battle bow again. It truly was a magnificent weapon when seen up close. He strapped the quiver to his thigh, where he found it quicker and more convenient to draw the arrows. He disappeared into the undergrowth of the forest, leaving the badly wounded human alone and lost in the middle of nowhere. Only then did Hannes realize his precarious position. His body trembled from the mortal wound, and his breathing grew sharper by the second. He was sweating, despite the low temperature. A warmth rose from his stomach to his chest, and then spread through the rest of his body. Blood flowed steadily, trickling down through his clothes until it reddened the snow beneath him. Every drop that spilled from his body depleted his strength, his energy, his life. The young man began to realize the unimaginable. He was dying. Soon his eyelids became too heavy. It became harder and harder to keep them open. His head was a leaden weight. It began to sway dangerously to one side. All his muscles weakened, gave way. The mighty Odin began to surrender to the sleep of death. In one of those dark moments, he heard a sound near him. The sound of footsteps crunching the snow. As best he could, he turned his head towards the noise and opened his trembling eyes. There was an unfamiliar figure beside him. Still, motionless, silent. It looked him straight in the eye. His hair was long and flowing, like Alwen. But it was not Alwen. He had an elegant body, like Garin. But he was not Garin. He carried a weapon in his right hand, a sharp, gleaming rod of steel aimed at the snow. His face was obscured behind a cloak that hid his features. Hansi's strength was almost a memory. He could barely breathe. Heavy and bleeding, his body finally collapsed on the snow at the feet of the unknown figure.